We do not have Todd Leuthäuser. He's unfortunately traveling right now, but we do have Jerry Desmond, of course, who is our legislative advocate in Sacramento. So this presentation is going to be roughly 25 minutes, and then it'll be followed up by Q&A. Please submit any questions that you have via the Q&A page that we've got there. And thank you all very much for participating. We're going to switch up here. The topics we're going to be covering today, we're going to look at the 2020 legislation that happened this year in a rather strange year. We didn't get as much stuff going as we normally would expect. And then we're going to take a look at national issues. David Kennedy is going to update us on some of the national issues that are of concern to us. And then Winston and I will talk a little bit about the pandemic effects on voting, particularly on efforts to reopen voting. And then Jerry is going to talk about Proposition 15, which is a proposition that's going to be on the November 3rd ballot. And some things that we need to be concerned about there. So we will move right along here. And the first one we're going to talk about is the BCDC reform. And I'm going to turn that over to Winston.
Thank you very much, Cleve. Many of you may be aware of here in the Northern California, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, which was started over 50 years ago, is really a good thing. Its main goal was to prevent bay fill. But over the years, it has had some challenges, and particularly challenges of late. Starting in 2017, people were really concerned about some of the onerous fines, the lack of consistency in how the fines were administered, and so forth. So RBOC was an advocate to Sacramento that requesting that an audit be held, and an audit was undertaken in 2018, and the results of that audit was done in 2019. As a result of the audit, they found a lot of recommendations to the organization to make it more consistent. As an output of that, Assemblyman and Speaker Pro Tem Kevin Mullen put forward a bill with bipartisan support, Assembly Bill 2809. That particular bill has a number of key aspects to it, but mainly to ensure, make sure the commission is, doing good oversight of the staff. They have found in the audit that on average, some of the issues lingered for 7 years. So really trying to find a timely way to do and handle these cases. Also, because there was somewhat onerous and sometimes arbitrary penalties, one of the things that they're required to do is develop a matrix for the fines for the penalties, and also a method for assessing penalties when there were multiple violations. The goal is to get compliance to the permits. It's not to be punitive. So this was an important. We get back there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Charles. It's important. So anyhow, the good news is, thanks to everybody's support, not only was the legislative created, it was passed with no opposing votes by both the legislature and the state senate. It went to the governor's desk, and RBOC sent a letter to request the signing of this bill into law. And as you'll see, there's lots of laws that didn't happen. They get pushed to 2021 because of the pandemic. This is one that did pass, and we're really excited about it. And our job going forward is to provide oversight to BCDC to ensure that they follow this new legislation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Cleve again to talk about Assembly Bill 1949.
Thanks, Winston. Yeah, it's nice to have a couple of bills that actually got passed that we supported. AB 1949 is signed. It expands the ORHEP program, the Ocean Resource Enhancement Hatchery Program. There is only one saltwater hatchery on the west coast of the U.S. That's in northern San Diego County. And up till now, it's been limited to raising white sea bass and releasing them, to benefit recreational fishing as well as commercial fishing. This new bill has expanded that program and actually funded it. And now there are 13 more species that are eligible to be raised that way. And the program expands out a little bit. They use facilities in different places, one of which, quite a prominent one, is at Southwestern Yacht Club in San Diego, where they raise a lot of the fingerling sea bass that go into that program. So we're glad to see that one. And now I'll turn this over to Jerry, who can talk about some of the legislation that did not pass.
Thank you, Cleve. And as Cleve and Winston both mentioned, there are a number of measures that did not make it across the finish line. Most often the rationale is that the legislature and the leadership and individual legislators as well focus their efforts on measures related to either COVID-19 or wildfires or homeless and homing and addressing those issues as a primary objective. And so we were involved in advocating each one of these bills. Just a quick overview, because each one of these could be introduced again next year. And in the first issue may be in action as we talk. RBOC, together with many other organizations, our hunting and fishing colleagues, as well as developers and agricultural interests, opposed AB 3030 that by Assembly Member Kalra, proposing to protect 30% of the land and water in the state by 2030. Our position was opposed unless amended to ensure that the measure included provisions specifically recognizing the boating sanctuaries and marine life protected areas and other boating waterways and oceans that are currently protected. We did not get the amendment in when the measure stopped in the Senate Appropriations Committee. And as we're speaking, I think we have a number of our colleagues on the participating here. The governor right now is supposed to be holding a press conference announcing an executive order that may take a number of these actions administratively by executive order as we speak. And so more to follow, and we could be quite active again. Two other measures we supported with others, our boating safety officer colleagues by Senator Monning from the Santa Cruz area, did not move forward because Senator Monning reprioritized his efforts, and they may be reintroduced next year. One is to expand the requirements to be licensed by the Division of Boating and Waterways for for-hire vessel operators, regardless of how many passengers they have on board. And then SB 904 to establish boat fix-it tickets for law enforcement for some minor correctable matters such as an outdated registration. Two other measures that we anticipate will see the light of day again next year. In 2019, AB 1387 was introduced by Assembly Member Wood to provide our fishing friends with the opportunity for a 365-day fishing license. It got held up because of a number of factors, and it may be reintroduced next year to keep the ball rolling to see if that logical opportunity can be there for fishing licenses. Another is introduced in 2019 as a new Office of Outdoor Recreation, became a proposed Office of Sustainable Outdoor Recreation by Assembly Member Friedman. It would be a cabinet level secretary position. RBOC has a position in support of the measure if it were to be amended to include a provision ensuring that boaters and recreational boaters and the fishing and recreational population had a prominent role within that new structure. And then secondly, to ensure that boating fees and taxes that we currently pay as a community to the state are not going to be redirected away from essential services and programs and infrastructure that are so important to boaters. So that's a preview of some of the major issues that could resurrect again next year. And I'd like next to turn to our national partner, Boat US, and Boat US Government Affairs. And we're fortunate to have David Kennedy to talk about the key issues at the national level. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Jerry, and appreciate the chance to come here and be with you all. Again, David Kennedy, I'm the manager of government affairs for Boat US. For those of you who don't know Boat US, and I hope that's not too many, we're a national organization of boaters. We've got over 770,000 members nationwide now, and 75,000 of those are in California. So very important state for us. And really, we're the ones here in DC and throughout the country on watch for boaters. And I preface all of these kinds of briefings these days by saying everything has to go through the filter of the election. And if anybody tells you they know what's going to happen in the election, tell them they should be in Las Vegas, because it's just so unknown at this point. But that said, there are still going to be issues, and no matter what happens, and this is something that's very important to what we do, is that we work with whoever is here. And so there are some issues that we see continuing, and we're going to continue to work on. The one that's really come up, it had been an old issue, or it had been from a few years back, but then really resurfaced back in the spring. And this is this question over interference with the GPS signal. There was some of you may remember from a few years back, there was a company called Light Squared that thought they came up with a clever way to create a new cell phone system. Unfortunately, they were going to use spectrum that's very close to the GPS signal, and really the way they designed it would have really interfered depending on how close you were to their towers. Ultimately, that system was rejected. The company ended up going bankrupt. Many of us thought that it had been pretty much put to rest at that. Still kind of knew that it was out there, but very quickly they got resurrected. They got an injection of new funds from a private equity company, and very quickly came back again and received approval to begin operations back in April. This was an approval from the FCC. We actually only had about 5 days notice of this, and caught a lot of people that are paying attention to this issue by surprise. If you think about all the different users of GPS, this was one that really, like I say, caught a lot of us. So a lot of people quickly mobilizing. It's not just boaters, it's anyone who has a use case for GPS. So aviation, construction, farmers, all that. We're getting in there and starting to explain why this is such a problem. We see it come around again, and really one of the problems is they just relied on testing that doesn't count on all of the users and such as individual boaters. So no calls to action at this point, but I think we'll see this really start come into play beginning of next year. So certainly something to keep an eye out for. Be a chance to interact with your members of Congress and other members of the administration on that. So that's number one. Second issue I'd like to talk about is the reauthorization of the Sportfish Restoration and Boating Trust Fund. And so this is the fund that goes where they capture the gas tax you pay on when you put fuel in your boat, tax on fishing equipment, a few other things, that then goes back out to all the programs that we like. Think of transient docks, vessel pump outs, fish habitat, protection of that, on the water law enforcement, boating safety, everything like that. So that's what the trust fund does. It does need to be reauthorized every 5 years or so. It was last done as part of the last highway bill. It's now part of the current highway bill discussions. Long history, political history of why it's there, but that's where they do it. And so you may have heard that they were sort of doing these larger infrastructure bills. We've been successful in keeping it reauthorized, part of that conversation. They did end up doing an extension of government funding, what they call the continuing resolution, where they just kept funding the government. But when they did the CR, they also included just a reauthorization for the trust fund for another year. So that's good news. We're going to continue to get the benefits of these programs. We're going to capture these tax dollars, the boating and angling tax dollars, and we're going to continue to work for a long-term reauthorization of it, and just the chances to do the policy tweaks to it. But we continue to keep that in mind and out there working on it. And then the issue that is just perennial here, the renewable fuel standard. And this is the law that is basically mandates that a certain, ever increasing amounts of ethanol be blended into gasoline. And for folks who have run into this and run into trouble with some of the parts on their boats, and I put myself in that category. This has really been a tough law to deal with, as we just see ethanol become more and more prevalent out there, and you just have a harder time getting ethanol-free fuel. So essentially, we're at a stalemate now from a policy standpoint. The advocates for the law have been successful in keeping it in place, but the reality is, because of changes in the way we're using fuel and the overall market, there's just no place to actually meet that mandate. So probably nothing is going to happen until we get past the election and really into 2021. The original law expires after that, so there's going to be a lot of policy action on it then. We have been spending time really pushing EPA to do more to protect against misfueling with any of the higher blends. There's what they call E15 and E85 and all kinds of different fuels out there that really, if you were to put it into your boat or any other small engine, basically any other off-road engine, think lawnmowers, snow throwers, weed trimmers, anything like that. Right now, there's only a requirement of one small sticker be on any pumps that dispense this higher blend. We don't think that's enough, and we're certainly pushing them to do more on misfueling mitigation. We think we're going to see some rules coming out on that here shortly. So those are the broad national issues that we pay attention to, but we're always out there looking out for boaters at the state level. Again, we benefit so much by having RBOC in this partnership, and certainly appreciate the chance to join you all today.
And thank you, David. Boaters statewide are fortunate to have Boat US at the federal level. And next we'll move to COVID-19 and the pandemic with Cleve.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, David. I also want to welcome Todd Lighthizer, who's joined the panel here. Todd is our Vice President from the Long Beach area. Okay, the boating restrictions that are in place. When the pandemic got started, San Diego County actually banned boating altogether. They were the only county that took that action. And so a lot of stuff that's been going on with opening boating up has been happening in San Diego because they had to work their way through getting that done. However, in most of the rest of the state, a lot of the organizations that organize boating and stuff like that chose not to, just because of the uncertainty there, and that uncertainty still persists. Anyway, in San Diego, a couple of groups got together and developed some standards, safe opening standards for boating. And they pressed that with the County Board of Supervisors and County Health in San Diego. And after a long effort, which included the county board sending the protocols to Sacramento for approval, which never happened, they persuaded the county board to approve those proposals, and those protocols are now incorporated in the San Diego County Health Order. The same thing could be done, of course, with any of the counties. If an effort is made to ask those counties to include the protocols in their health order, it should be successful. There's an example right now. RBOC has developed a very similar set of protocols, and we have written to the governor, to the California Health Department, to Department of Boating and Waterways, and we're pressing to get that protocol approved to just make it, to clarify the situation for boating organizations so that they can feel comfortable organizing regattas and so forth. One of the elements in the protocol is the contact tracing, and there's different ways of doing that. In San Diego, most of the regattas are organized, and the boats that are in the regattas registered through the Regatta Network. And in Regatta Network, they can list all of the crew members, and that's a very practical way of providing for contact tracing. Anyway, there are other elements relating to this, and so I will turn this over to Winston, who will talk about some of the efforts to provide financial assistance to some of the clubs.
Thank you, Cleve. And for those of you that I've just posted a link to the reopening protocol that Cleve has mentioned that RBC's developed. Of course, it's up at rboc.org/voterbrief, but the link to that document's there. And hopefully we're seeing in Northern California, it's really a piecemeal approach to what safety protocols are, clubs and areas and what racing and how people are doing it. So again, RBOC's support of this standardized approach could get some consistency across the state on best practices during this difficult time. In addition to that, and we've talked about this a bunch, is the financial relief for clubs. Clubs are really small businesses, and they provide a great deal of support and outreach to the communities. But it's been a difficult time, and so we have been insistent on adding 501c7 clubs, organizations, which most clubs are, to consider them small businesses and include them in the next round of payroll protection program. There's employees, there's utilities, it pays for lots of things. And right now, who knows what the next round of COVID relief is going to look like. It seems like it's changing on an hourly basis, but we hope and will continue to push that when this does finally come, 501c7s will be included in addition to 501c3s and others that are already included in this funding. There's other things that are available, the economic injury disaster loans, EIDL loans, which are low interest loans that could be applied for. There's also some state funds that are available for, particularly useful for buying hand sanitizer, things you need to do for COVID. And that was done through the California State Fund. So there are some avenues available, but we hope that in this next round of PPP, clubs can be included as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry to talk about the upcoming Prop 15.
You bet it. Thank you, Winston. And folks, if you have just a reminder, if you do have some questions or comments on any of these matters, if you don't mind adding that in the chat box, when we conclude here, we're going to address them and answer all the questions. And so we appreciate that and look forward to that dialogue. Prop 15 is showing up now in more and more discussions among clubs and marinas. And it is Prop 15 on the November 3rd ballot. For those who've been around since 1978, there's always been a threat of this split roll tax initiative. It would remove the protections that were enacted, believe it or not, it was back in 1978 now, on Prop 13, that protects properties from tax increases and puts a cap. The initiative would state that commercial and industrial properties would be assessed at fair market value by the county appraisers, which is basically, pretty much what the property would sell for. This would phase in starting in 2022, and the appraisers would assess the properties, reassess properties every 3 years. For some properties, this process would start in 2025. So for a small group, that would be a small business with 50% or more of the occupied footage occupied by a small business, which would be a business with fewer than 50 employees, independently owned and owning real property in California. So those would begin to be reassessed in 2025. There are also exemptions in there in the proposition for businesses operating out of a home, businesses that own 3 million or less of non-residential commercial property, and of course residences, residential rental, and some agricultural properties as well. Now the opponents of the initiative have been stating that there are statements by the proponents that are advocating for this being the first step at going at residential properties, but it would need another initiative. And then there is a sweetener. There is a provision that would eliminate personal property taxes on the first $500,000 of combined equipment and other personal property. So what would this do? It is estimated to raise by the independent legislative analyst office between $6 and $11.5 billion each year on an annual basis. And the monies would be spent amongst not only the counties, I think it's $700 million to implement and reassess and their role, also to schools. And the campaigns for the initiative are emphasizing the need for schools to receive the money, especially now with the extra burdens they have with the COVID-19 pandemic. There is a political context. The proponents include, notably, candidates Joe Biden for president, Kamala Harris for vice president, and Governor Gavin Newsom, and others. The opponents are primarily the advocates for business interests, starting with the Chamber of Commerce, including a number of local chambers and specific industries, both those that own property and those that rent, with the thought that the property taxes will be passed on to them as renters. So what are the potential impacts on clubs? Some smaller clubs could actually see a reduction in the property taxes they pay based on those personal property items that we mentioned, the first 500,000. However, some larger clubs could potentially see some significant increases in the top property taxes they pay. For many clubs, the property taxes are a significant part of their annual expenses. And we're finding that there are private marinas that are very much concerned about the taxes they would pay, very similar to the clubs. What RBOC would recommend is for clubs to look at their own situation, see where they would fit into the provisions of the split roll tax initiative, look at your own situation, see what would happen, and then take action to, as you deem appropriate for your club and your members and individual boaters as well. I note that our colleagues with the Marine and Recreation Association, MRA, have issued a grassroots call to action in opposition because it is viewed so detrimental to their interests. There are campaigns and websites to take action if you're for it. Yes on 15, if you're no on prop15.org. But it's worth taking a look at because there could be an impact on your club. Okay, and with that, we'll move to past president and director Ray Durazo on some of the other advocacy issues that are continuing forward.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm going to look at three issues. First is the Delta Tunnel. I don't think I have to spend a lot of time explaining to you in the group today what that's about. It's a 17-year, multi-billion-dollar project proposed. And while we are not taking a position on the issue of water allocation, we see that as a separate issue. We're taking a very strong position in opposition to the project because of its impacts on recreational boating, as well as on fisheries. The second issue is one that's been around for a long time, copper-based anti-fouling paints. This is one of those that seems to go dormant and then all of a sudden pops up again. And right now it is active with the focus in Southern California and specifically Marina del Rey. Our position has been consistent on this matter. We believe that if there are alternative paints that are as effective, as affordable, and as available as copper-based paints, we're all in favor of that. But at the moment, there are none of those available and meeting those criteria. So our position continues to be opposition to any restrictions on the ability of boaters to utilize effective anti-fouling paints containing copper. The third one is boater-generated taxes and fees. As has already been mentioned, every time you renew your certification on your boat, every time you buy fuel and other expenses relating to the maintenance of your boat, there are taxes and fees. And that revenue is supposed to be used for infrastructure and other programs that benefit boating. Recently, we've had a hard time getting a clear fix on exactly how much money is involved, where it's going, how it is being spent, etc. And we're working with the Division of Boating and Waterways to clarify that. We will continue to do that to make sure that the money is properly appropriated, properly spent. With that, I'll turn the matter back to Cleve for the next part of the program.
Thanks, Ray. And that wraps up the presentation that we have here. If you've got any questions, please send them in the chat box feature, and we'll do our best to answer them. And once again, thank you all very much for signing into this program.
So next, do we perhaps request that Peter Phillips, RBOC Director from the San Diego area, lead us through some of the questions in the chat and direct those questions to some of the panelists to see if we might be able to help provide some answers.
Yes, the first question is from Alita Rethmeyer, and David answered this during the session, but maybe you'd like to elaborate. Alita says she understands that ethanol is not required in some southern states and it is now being discontinued. David?
Yeah, thank you. That not to my knowledge, and really with the RFS, it's this mandate that specific amounts of ethanol be blended into the system. And so even if a state wants to sell, or I should say, you know, an individual retailer wants to sell ethanol-free fuel, they're having a harder and harder time getting it because the refineries have to mix this in. So it's really created this imbalance in the whole system. And we really ran against something, it's called the blend wall, where we only use so much fuel. And so yeah, up to 10% we're okay. Once we go over 10%, that's when it starts hurting us. And so as far as I know, nothing specific in southern states. There were state mandates that had this, and some like Iowa and Wisconsin have a mandate that they have to blend ethanol. Florida had one, they did repeal that. It still hasn't changed the math of the national effort. So that's why it really is this, we need this national reform on it. So.
Thank you, David. The next question is from Patricia Webster, and this looks like a good one for you, Jerry. Priority-wise, what letters can we send in support for bills or propositions or all?
Yes, and well, that's a very good question, and we appreciate that. One of the strengths of RBOC historically and still is the interest of voters individually and also with their clubs to get involved and get engaged at a grassroots level, you know, to get a hold of your elected officials on key issues. Go through the years, that has been instrumental to our success on a number of advocacy issues. You know, we're at a spot where, fortunately, the legislature has concluded its session. And so the legislative issues that we just described as 2 bills that passed, and we had a slide on those several bills that did not pass, we need to see new bills introduced. They'll come back in December quickly and introduce a few bills, but we'll get going again in January. The initiatives, however, those are on the ballot on November 3rd. And those aren't voted upon by legislators. They'll be voted on by citizens and voting. So if perhaps the right kind of action is to, if you feel strongly enough about, for instance, Proposition 15, is to let you and your neighbors and your friends and colleagues know of your desires and influence the vote amongst those in your community. If you're for it or if you're against it, it's really at the initiative level at this point, at the moment. We may find, because there's a press conference being initiated right now by the governor and his administration that may announce an executive action regarding AB 30% protections of water and land by 2030 in some context and at some time frame, and to see whether there is a need for grassroots action. The best way to keep apprised when we do a call to action is to either, you can, on our website, rboc.org, there's an email subscription list that we send out calls to action for. And then we have a dedicated section of the website called Call to Action. And maybe, I don't know if Cleve has more to add on calls to action at this moment.
Yeah, if we identify particular bills that are sponsored by, you know, some representative, some legislator, we will issue a call for action that will go out through Southern California Yachting Association and the Pacific Interclub Yachting Associations. And we will ask clubs to contact their members to do a campaign of contacting their own legislators to influence their opinion on those issues. but we can really only do that for stuff that is happening in the legislature. As Jerry mentioned, the initiative process does not lend itself to that sort of a call for action. And so that's the reason we haven't done anything on this Proposition 15.
You know, I can think of, and thank you, Cleve, just one more that does come to mind. We did talk about COVID-19 and the pandemic and a request for safe guidelines for reopening, such as what San Diego has been able to accomplish in its public health order. If anybody on the call is interested in pursuing that with their county or contacting the governor's office, I could see value in that. And we have the letter we have written and request for safe reopening guidelines to the governor that perhaps as a takeaway from this, we could set up on our website for boaters and clubs and in different regions to get a hold of their elected officials to make sure that there's an awareness and an acknowledgement that boating is not only safe on the water, but it's important for our mental health and physical health as well, and that it ought to be a priority for reopening. And so maybe that's, as I'm thinking out loud with the panelists, maybe that's a potential action that we can take out of this to equip interested boaters on that issue.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Jerry. We got something else there, Peter?
The next question is from Bill Dysart. He says, when Prop 13 was initially passed, there was much confusion regarding application of the proposition to boats. It was subsequently determined that it did apply to boats. Now he's wondering, is there any danger of this erosion of the limitation and its effect on the boating community? Jerry or Cleve?
I'll defer to Jerry on that one.
Well, and that's part of there's always a risk. And I think the opponents to Prop 15 are quite concerned that if this initiative is able to pass after all these years, it had been considered politically the third rail of politics here in California for a long time, that nobody dared, advocate and put their name behind an effort to, undo any part of Prop 13. There is a real sense of there being a risk to any protection, any protection from increased taxes on a variety of things, starting with this. There is some thought that the governor, Newsom and his leadership, tamped down enthusiasm in the legislature for taxes on rich, what we call rich, higher income individuals, in order to focus the efforts on tax increases to this proposition as being extremely important to the state budget and a $53 billion COVID-19 hole that had to be filled as well. And if there is an open door on taxes, this could be a beginning of others we will see, whether it's residential taxes, personal tax, personal property, boats and vessels. There is a real fear of that risk in political quarters. Yeah, Winston's the slippery slope, I think, is what Winston's showing us there.
And further to that, there was some question whether docks were constitute property. If you're a club or a marina, do your docks constitute property? That's not very well defined. However, we have looked at some sources, and it appears that docks would be considered part of your property and therefore subject to that tax. So that kind of elevates the bar there a little bit for this thing. Do have another one, Peter?
Yes, a couple more. David Captain asks, who enforces copper paint rules?
Well, and Cleve is certainly an expert on this topic as well. So the approach that's been taken in California really has been on a water basin by water basin area. So San Diego saw it first, and what happened with Shelter Island, and then we've certainly seen efforts in Newport and then Marina del Rey, where the responsible body, the government body, gets told that they need to start limiting the levels. They in turn will then start putting limits on individual groups in there. And in most cases, this is telling the recreational boat slip holders that they need to go to non-copper alternatives. So it's been this evolution going forward. right now, copper anti-fouling paints, they're approved by the EPA. They're an approved pesticide, anti-foulant. And so this really, in California, it's been a basin by basin basis. Cleve, I don't know if you got another sort of take on that, but.
Yeah, just to expand it a little bit. Yeah, the copper paints are a licensed pesticide nationally as well as in California. The Department of Pesticide Regulation in California has licensed it. They did do some modifications to the types of paints that qualify, but there's still a number of copper-based paints that are still legal pesticides. However, there's no question that there are elevated levels of copper in any of the basins where boats are stored, and it comes from the copper paint. However, there's a fairly significant body of evidence that shows that while the levels of copper are elevated, they're not actually hurting anything. And RBOC is advocating very strongly that the responsible agencies, which in this case would be the regional water boards, test the waters. There's a water effect ratio test, site-specific test for each marina, each body of water, and determine if the levels of copper that are present there are actually hurting anything. That was done in San Francisco Bay about 20 years ago, and San Francisco Bay got a clean bill of health. They had elevated levels of copper, significantly elevated levels, but no biological harm was being caused to any of the benthic organisms there. And so San Francisco Bay was granted an exception from being on the 303D list for copper, and so that problem doesn't exist up there. But California does not have that, and RBOC would like to see the State Water Board come up with a recommendation for site-specific studies so that we can make the determination for all the water bodies in the state.
And Cleve, David goes on to ask, who is checking on bottom paints and what is the acceptable amount of copper?
Okay, nobody is checking on bottom paints except for the Department of Pesticide Regulation, and they have specified how much copper and at what levels can be included in that paint. And those paints are the only paints that are legal to use in the state of California. All the boatyards use those same paints. What the precise amounts are, I don't know. They are determined by pesticide regulations, and they are now called low leach copper paints. The point being that the speed at which the copper is leached out of the paint to inhibit the organisms that are trying to grow on your boat leach out slowly enough that they do no harm to any other organisms that might be there.
Okay, thank you, Cleve. The next question is from Stephen Caldero regarding statewide plans for marine flare collection and recycling. Jerry has provided a brief answer, but Winston, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, we had an update last Saturday at the PICY Leadership Conference from Vivian Matuk from the Department of Boating and Waterways, Coastal Commission, and the Coastal Commission. This is a big problem for boaters. We're required to have flares, not older than 3 years old. And we all know that flares last a lot longer. But when you get after 3 years, you get a new set that starts to build up. And the problem is, where do you take them? And to properly dispose of them, it is extremely difficult and expensive. So there have been several. There was one in San Francisco, one in San Mateo, and one in Alameda. There's another one coming up, a collection event. Now, the challenge with these is multiple, and this is really important for all boaters. they have these one-day events. They got to space everybody out, so because they don't want everybody in the parking lot with a whole bunch of explosive things. They don't want people at their club say, "Bring all your flares over to the club, and we'll drive them to the disposal." I mean, that's, you know, can you imagine the excitement would happen if those things went off? They're all unstable, old, and you know, considered explodable devices. So what they've been doing is having these one-day events, but the problem is few people sign up. It costs tens of thousands of dollars to run this event for the shipping and the proper shipping containers and the people to be there. So first, when there's an event, take advantage of it, because it may never ever happen again. You may be stuck with them. Second thing is that if you're, what Vivian was suggesting, is contact your county. There is money available from Cal Recycle for these programs. That's what's funded all of these events so far. And there just needs to be a request from your county to Cal Recycle for funding for an event, and they can put together a single day event where they can collect these flares. It's a huge problem. I know people say, "Oh, well, you know, burn them off on, you know, different events." Let me tell you, the fire situations that we are having here in the state, this is not a time to be burning flares. And if you burn them out in the water, you're going to have people come rescue you. The Coast Guard's not necessarily going to, you know, tolerate this, even if you ask for the event. So the best approach is, A, take advantage of them. Alameda's got one coming up October 18th. So if you're in that Alameda County, have your boat there, live there, go to it. If you want one in your county, work with your county pollution prevention folks, hazardous waste folks, and ask them to get a grant from Cal Recycle, and you can have a localized event in your area. We've got to do something about this. Hopefully, at some point, we can change the regulations. Maybe the fact that, you know, and I'm going off a little bit, but this is a huge problem. Maybe the fact that if you sell them, you got to take them back. That's one approach. Another approach is, I think they ought to expand from 3 years to maybe 5 years, or even 8 years. That, even to 6 years would cut in half the amount of flares that we're stuck with. And we all know that after 6 years, those flares are still good if you kept them in a dry container. And if you haven't kept them in a dry container, they're not good anyhow. So lots could be done, but from your standpoint, work with your county agencies.
Okay, and thank you, Winston. The final question comes from Robert Willis, and his question is, who actually will monitor BCDC? Will it just be RBOC?
Well, I know there's other organizations. There was an organization started specifically as an oversight, and that's the the Bay Stewardship Alliance, also the Bay Planning Commission, which you know, PICYA has a representative on the board of the Bay Planning Commission. It's really, I think, multiple agencies to look at it and make sure that they're doing the job they're supposed to, monitoring. It's a lot easier now to monitor meetings than me having to drive back and forth to San Francisco. Zoom, I can zoom into these meetings. But we all need to keep an eye and make sure as they start to get the permits that they, you know, follow the new regulations.
Okay, thank you, Winston. And just back to the previous question about the expired marine flares. David Captain is saying, how can he get a list of sites in Marina Del Rey area or LA County? And you're saying that he should contact what agency to try and promote a program?
I would contact his hazardous waste facility there in his county and work with them to get a grant, because there's money at Cal Recycle for these kinds of grants. Get a grant from them to put on a collection event in their county. I can put them in contact, you know, with, if they want to connect with me with the work that Vivian's doing, and I'm sure she's glad to put you in contact with the right people.
Okay, great. Thank you, Winston. That completes all of the attendees' questions. And I'll turn it back over to you, Cleve.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everybody, for your questions here. If there's any last-minute ones, please do, jump in right now if you can. Or if you go onto the RBOC website, rboc.org, you can contact any board member directly. If you go to the members section there, send an email, and we will try to answer specific questions that way. RBOC does have board members distributed, fairly evenly throughout the state. There's 9 from Northern California and 9 from Southern California. And so, there's always going to be some member of our board that is somewhat close to where you're at. So if you want to get some specific information about your area, you might be able to get some help that way. Other than that, does anyone have any closing remarks? Peter?
Cleve, we did get one additional question. It seems that Alita Rethmeyer enjoyed the presentation and she's wondering when the next one will be.
Good question. Not sure when the next one will be. We like to do these things when there's some specific issues coming up. And of course, right now we've got the specific issue of Prop 15 coming up. So perhaps we could do another one before too long and focus more directly on Prop 15. Our board, our executive committee will have to talk about that and figure that out. But we will certainly be letting everybody know in good time about the next one that we're going to organize. Jerry, do you have anything you'd like to say in closing here?
Well, just add to Cleve's comments. We appreciate your feedback. If you think this is helpful, if you have some comments or suggestions, we mean this to be an informative discussion and dialogue, as well as a presentation. And if you do let us know if you like it, you'd like it more frequently, if you thought maybe others would be interested or your club to get out a notice to your members to participate, let us know, because we're providing it for you. And if there's a level of interest, we'll work to meet that interest, I think, amongst the executive committee and the panelists here. And we just appreciate everybody's time and of course appreciate our national advocacy arm, Boat US, and David Kennedy in particular being involved. And that's it for me, Cleve.
If I could just add one last thing before people go, you can save the chat. There's a number of links in there. Just go to the chat, the bottom right-hand corner, click on the little 3 buttons, and you can save it as a text file. So you might want to do that before we end the session.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for participating. I hope you all learned a little bit about what's going on in California and nationally with boating. And look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you again for participating. I guess we could shut her down, Jerry.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.